So I'm Christine Crane, and I'm a writer based here in Gainesville. And I'm going to tell a story about becoming a journalist. So 2 weeks after college graduation, I was on a flight to Rome, Italy. I had studied Italian in college and had gotten a scholarship to do research. And what I really wanted to do was become a foreign correspondent. And I remember on the flight, it was an overnight flight to Rome, and I had a book with me called Night Flight. And it was a book by Georgie Ann Geyer, who had been a foreign correspondent in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And she had also graduated from my same college, and I wanted to be like her, a foreign correspondent in Italy. And of course, when I got to Rome, I realized how difficult that was. Rome and Italy were very saturated with foreign correspondents, many veteran reporters. Rome is considered kind of a plum position for veteran correspondents, war reporters as well, just looking to do kind of light cultural features. And it also had a lot of course, young aspiring reporters like myself. So it was a little bit tricky to break into at first. I did the sort of requisite AP internship, which was more like a hazing experience than a real internship. We used to have to get pizza and cigarettes for the bureau chief and that type of thing as interns. But it kind of broke me into the reality of, I guess, being tough as a reporter, not thinking of being a reporter in Italy as just this romantic proposition. So that was good. And I had a couple of things going for me. I was fluent in Italian, and I was also really just fearless, the kind of fearlessness you have when you're 20, and then gradually you become a little bit more hesitant. But I was, I didn't mind just basically knocking on doors and asking, more established reporters if they needed help or for a hand. And so, gradually I made my way. And I started writing for an expat magazine called The American in Italia, which is still going, and I still write for it. In fact, I'm deputy editor and a columnist. And that really taught me about story and finding stories in this vast landscape that is Italy. And so I stuck with that, and I did other, freelancing gigs. I covered the Vatican quite a bit. And I discovered that, Italy was a really good training ground to become a journalist in a couple of ways. For me, at least, one thing is that Italians love to talk, and I love to listen, and I love their language, and so it was really easy for me to kind of just sink into listening to people and listening for their stories. And the other thing is that it has a lot of human interest stories just naturally. It's a very obviously culturally interesting place. And so many threads make narrative there really alive. And so I had a great run of it. And then I kind of got a big break in terms of covering a really big news story, which is when Pope John Paul II was dying. And so I was there for that. At the time I was interning at the Wall Street Journal. And so I got in on the whole papal transition, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was definitely a highlight of my career and life to be there in that moment. At the same time, at the very same moment, coincidentally, and I didn't find this out until weeks later, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and so that changed my whole trajectory of staying in Italy and becoming a foreign correspondent. So I left, and I left actually at, just when I had been also offered a full-time position with a news outlet there. And I remember a good friend saying, you're leaving just when you can reap the rewards. But of course it was, I felt that I had to go and be with my mother. And that also changed my whole trajectory. I became a health reporter back here in America. And it took me a while, it took a few years I did a graduate program in health reporting, and then I had various positions. And then I saw a job posting for a health reporter in Gainesville, Florida, and I was like, oh, that looks interesting. It was at the daily newspaper, and I'd been doing more sort of medical editing and medical journal writing at that point, and I really wanted to get back into journalism, daily reporting, because I had loved it so much in Italy. So on a whim, I just applied, not knowing anyone in town. And they flew me down, I remember, for the interview. I'd never been to the sort of deep south before, and I remember just looking out and noticing the lush landscape, all, the trees. It was really beautiful, and it, went through my mind, this must be what Vietnam is like. I've never been to Vietnam, but I somehow had that association in my mind. Not thinking until 4 or 5 years later that, how coincidental that, thinking back to Night Flight, the book by Georgie Ann Geyer and her coverage of Vietnam. And I think coming to Florida as a reporter was, in retrospect, actually my real kind of becoming a foreign correspondent, if you will. I'm from the Midwest. I had been very Italianized during my decade in Italy, and then came back and had only lived in big cities, New York and DC. So coming here was really eye-opening, and especially as a reporter, I got to cover lots of different stories about rural health. Especially when I was a reporter in Ocala, I covered the Confederate flag controversy, covering the Springs and environmental issues, covering executions. I mean, it's all been a really rich territory. And so I feel that I can sort of legitimately now call myself a foreign correspondent, even if it's not in Italy, it's in Florida.